Somewhere beneath the Italian sun, in the quiet fields south of Naples, the grass still grows over ground that once shook with the footsteps of 60,000 freed slaves. The vineyards stretch out in long, unhurried rows. The birds settle on ancient stone, and if you listen closely, past the wind, past the centuries, you can almost hear the distant echo of a name that once made the most powerful civilization on earth hold its breath. Spartacus. It is a name that has outlived empires. A name whispered by senators in marble halls and shouted by desperate men in the dust of forgotten arenas. He was not born a king. He held no title, commanded no legions by birthright, and wore no crown. He was, by every measure Rome cared to use, nothing more than property. A man bought, sold, and trained to die for the amusement of others. And yet, for 3 extraordinary years between 73 and 71 BC, this single individual brought the Roman Republic to the edge of genuine fear. Not the performative concern of politicians, not the passing anxiety of a border skirmish, but real, breathless, unfamiliar terror, the kind that crawls into the Senate chamber and sits down uninvited. To understand why, we must first understand what Rome was at the time of his rebellion. This was not a fading power. This was not a civilization in decline, vulnerable and tired. The Roman Republic of the 1st century BC was, arguably, the most formidable military machine the ancient world had ever produced. Its legions had crushed Carthage. They had swept through Greece, humbled Macedonia, and planted their standards across Spain and North Africa. Rome did not simply win wars, it absorbed entire civilizations, folding them into its ever-expanding body like a creature that grows stronger with every meal. To challenge Rome was not bold, it was, by all rational calculation, suicidal. And Spartacus challenged Rome. He was born, most historians believe, in Thrace, a rugged, mountainous region that sprawled across what we now call Bulgaria, northern Greece, and the European edge of Turkey. The Thracians were not a single unified people, but rather a patchwork of fierce, independent tribes known throughout the ancient world for their warrior culture, their horsemanship, and their deep, unshakable resistance to foreign rule. Ancient writers describe them as tall, powerfully built, and possessing a kind of stubborn vitality that made them both valuable allies and deeply inconvenient enemies. Rome knew the Thracians well. It had fought them, traded with them, recruited them, and, when the opportunity arose, enslaved them. Spartacus, at some point in his early life, crossed paths with the Roman military system. The ancient sources differ on precisely how. Some suggest he served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army before deserting. Others claim he was captured in one of Rome's many Thracian campaigns. What we know with greater certainty is the destination that awaited him, the gladiatorial training school of Lentulus Batiatus in the sun-bleached city of Capua, about 100 miles south of Rome itself. Capua's gladiator schools were not academies of honor. They were, in essence, elegant prisons. The men held within them were conditioned, sharpened, and maintained the way one might care for a blade, not out of love, but utility. They were fed well enough to build muscle, trained well enough to put on a spectacle, and watched closely enough that rebellion, in theory, was impossible. The Romans had been running this system for generations. They were very, very good at it, which makes what happened next all the more remarkable. In 73 BC, Spartacus and roughly 70 fellow gladiators broke free from Batiatus's school, using, according to the sources, little more than kitchen implements. Cleavers, spits, the crude tools of the cookhouse. They fought their way past their guards, seized a wagon of gladiatorial weapons in the streets of Capua, and fled into the countryside. It was, on the surface, a minor incident. A footnote: the Roman authorities dispatched a militia to deal with it, fully expecting the matter to be resolved within days. It was not resolved within days. What followed was one of the most extraordinary episodes in all of ancient history. A swelling, surging, almost impossible uprising that would grow from 70 desperate men into an army of tens of thousands, men, women, and children drawn from the vast, invisible underclass upon whose backs the Roman world was built, and at its head, guiding it with a tactical intelligence that stunned Roman commanders again and again, stood the Thracian gladiator who should have died, quietly and profitably, on the sand of some provincial arena. In the segments ahead, we will walk with him. From the slopes of Vesuvius to the shores of the Strait of Messina, from his first impossible victories to his final, devastating stand, this is a story of defiance, of strategy, of human endurance pressed beyond all reasonable limits. This is the story of Spartacus, and it begins, as so many great stories do, in a cage. There is a particular quality to the southern Italian landscape in late summer that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not stood within it. The heat is not aggressive, not sharp, the way desert heat can be. It is something more patient than that. It settles over the hills and the olive groves and the dry riverbeds like a great warm hand, unhurried, ancient, as if the land itself has simply decided to rest for a season and is inviting you to do the same. The air smells of wild herbs and warm stone. Lizards pause on broken walls. The distant sea, on a clear day, catches the light and holds it. It was into this landscape that Spartacus and his 70 companions disappeared in the summer of 73 BC. They would not be resting. The first thing to understand about those initial weeks of the rebellion is how precarious the situation truly was. The popular imagination tends to picture the slave revolt as something that erupted fully, formed, a roaring tide that immediately threatened Rome. The reality was considerably more fragile. 70 men, many of them foreign-born, in unfamiliar terrain, without supply lines, without shelter, without allies, and with the full machinery of Roman law enforcement already turning in their direction. They were fugitives, not yet revolutionaries. They were surviving, not yet fighting. And survival, in those first critical days, required every ounce of the intelligence and composure that Spartacus clearly possessed in extraordinary measure. The group made for the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. This choice tells us something important about Spartacus immediately. A panicked man, a man thinking only about the next hour, runs for the coast. He looks for a ship, a border, an exit. But Spartacus chose high ground. He chose a position of natural defense. Vesuvius in 73 BC was not the famous destroyer. It would become over a century later. It had not erupted in living memory, and its upper slopes were densely covered in wild woodland and vine. It was remote enough to evade casual pursuit, elevated enough to observe approaching forces, and sufficiently close to the fertile farmland of Campania that foraging parties could descend, gather what they needed, and return before anyone could organize a meaningful response. This was not the thinking of a desperate man. This was the thinking of a tactician. Rome, for its part, was not yet particularly alarmed. The Senate dispatched a praetor, a mid-ranking magistrate with military authority, named Gaius Claudius Glaber, at the head of a force of approximately 3,000 men. 3,000 against 70. The Romans were not so much crushing a rebellion as swatting an inconvenience. Glaber marched his men to the base of Vesuvius, identified the single accessible path that led up to the fugitives' position, and settled his forces across it. The logic was sound and simple. He did not need to fight his way up. He merely needed to wait. Eventually, the gladiators would run out of food, run out of water, run out of options. They would surrender or they would starve. Either outcome suited Rome perfectly well. Glaber made camp. His soldiers relaxed. Someone, in the quiet confidence of certain victory, perhaps poured wine. What happened next has been recorded by ancient historians and has lost none of its vividness across 20 centuries. Spartacus and his men collected the wild vines that grew in abundance across the upper slopes of Vesuvius and wove them patiently, methodically, into long ropes, strong enough to bear a man's weight. Under the cover of darkness, they lowered themselves down the sheer cliff face on the far side of the mountain. The side Gladiator had not thought to watch, because it was not a path. It was a wall of rock dropping into shadow, and no reasonable person would descend it in the night. Spartacus was not, at this point, interested in being reasonable. Once at the base, the gladiators moved quickly and quietly around the mountain's perimeter, came up behind the Roman camp, and fell upon Gladiator's sleeping soldiers from the rear. The Romans, caught utterly unprepared, expecting an enemy above them rather than behind, broke almost immediately. Gladiator's camp was overrun, his forces scattered, his military equipment, weapons, armor, supply wagons, all captured. It was a rout, clean and total. The first significant military engagement of the rebellion had not merely gone in Spartacus's favor. He had engineered it to be almost entirely risk-free. Word spread quickly, as decisive words always do. Here we must pause for a moment and consider something that the ancient sources mention but rarely dwell upon with the attention it deserves. The population of Roman Italy in the 1st century BC was, in ways that modern observers often find startling, overwhelmingly enslaved. Conservative modern estimates suggest that somewhere between 30 and 40% of the entire population of the Italian peninsula existed in legal bondage. In the great agricultural estates of the south, the latifundia, those vast, silent farms that had swallowed up the small holdings of generations, the enslaved worked in conditions that ranged from brutal to barely survivable. These were not people living in comfort, awaiting nothing in particular. These were people living under sustained institutional violence, separated from their families, their languages, their homes, stripped of every legal protection and every human dignity the Roman world had to offer. And every single one of them, from the moment the news of Vesuvius began to travel the countryside roads and vineyard tracts of Campania, knew exactly who Spartacus was and exactly what he represented. They came in their hundreds first, then their thousands. Runaway slaves from the estates, herdsmen from the hills, free but desperately poor, men with nothing to lose, and suddenly, something for the first time to gain. Former soldiers from allied peoples, the dispossessed and the forgotten and the furious. They poured into Spartacus's growing camp, on the slopes and in the fields surrounding Vesuvius, like water finding its level, drawn by something more powerful than any single promise or proclamation. They were drawn by the visible, undeniable fact that it was possible. That 70 men with kitchen tools had embarrassed a Roman army. That the machine was not, perhaps, invincible. Spartacus did not simply receive these new arrivals. He organized them. This is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of his achievement. Anyone can inspire a crowd. History is littered with charismatic figures who gathered desperate people around a banner and marched them enthusiastically toward disaster. What Spartacus did was categorically different. He took thousands of men with no military training, no shared language in many cases, no common culture, no tradition of working together, and shaped them into something capable of meeting Roman legions in the field and winning. He drilled them. He imposed discipline. The ancient sources are clear that Spartacus maintained order within his camp with considerable firmness. He organized the captured Roman equipment and distributed it. He trained cavalry. He established a command structure. He was building an army. His two chief lieutenants during this period were men named Crixus and Oenomus, both Gauls, a fact worth noting because it illustrates both the remarkable diversity of the rebellion and one of its deepest internal tensions. The enslaved population of Italy in the 1st century BC was drawn from virtually every corner of the known world. Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, Africans from regions Rome barely had names for. They had been gathered from a dozen different cultures, stripped of individual identity, and pressed into common servitude. Spartacus's genius was in finding again and again what those cultures shared rather than what divided them. He built coalition where Rome had always assumed fragmentation was inevitable. He built loyalty where Rome had always built only fear. Rome dispatched a second force, then a third. Another praetor, Publius Varinius, was sent south with a more substantial army and firm instructions to end the matter decisively. What followed across the autumn and winter of 73 BC was a series of engagements that read, from the Roman perspective, with a kind of numbing disbelief. Varinius's forces were outmaneuvered, ambushed, and defeated in detail across the Campanian countryside. At one extraordinary moment, Spartacus's cavalry managed to capture the horse of Varinius himself. A humiliation so personal and so symbolically devastating that it would have been considered almost incomprehensible to Roman military culture. A praetor's horse in the hands of a Thracian gladiator. Rome was beginning to take notice in an entirely different way now. By the time winter settled over the Italian peninsula and the campaign season drew to its natural close, Spartacus controlled a significant portion of southern Italy. He had not simply survived the autumn. He had expanded, recruited, and grown more formidable with each engagement. His army, which had been 70 men in the spring, was now estimated by ancient sources at somewhere between 70 and 100,000 strong. The precise numbers are, as always with ancient history, a matter of scholarly debate and reasonable caution. But the direction of travel is not in question. This force was large enough, organized enough, and battle-hardened enough that the Roman Senate could no longer frame the situation as a domestic policing matter. They were now facing something that required a different kind of attention entirely. But here is the question that haunts this period of the rebellion more than any other, and it is worth sitting with quietly before we move forward. What did Spartacus actually want? The ancient sources, Plutarch, Appian, Florus among them, offer glimpses of an answer, but none of those sources were sympathetic to the rebellion, and none of them were particularly interested in the interior life of a Thracian slave. They recorded his victories because they could not be ignored. They noted his discipline and his intelligence because it explained the embarrassments Rome suffered. But his actual intentions, his deeper motivations, the vision, if he had one, of what a successful rebellion might ultimately look like, these things slip between the lines of the ancient record, like water through open hands. Some passages suggest he wished to lead his followers out of Italy entirely, north, across the Alps, and back toward their various homelands. Others suggest he had grander ambitions, that he spoke to his men of marching on Rome itself. Some modern historians have framed him as a proto-revolutionary, a man ahead of his time who understood that slavery as a system had to be dismantled root and branch. Others caution against reading modern political frameworks into ancient motivations and suggest his goals were always more practical, more immediate, more human, simply to be free, and to help others be free alongside him. The truth is probably somewhere in the space between all of these readings, shifting and evolving as circumstances shifted around him. He was not writing manifestos, he was fighting. And as long as he was winning, the question of what came after winning could remain beautifully, necessarily, unresolved. Winter settled. His campfires burned across southern Italy in their thousands. His sentries walked their posts in the cold, clear dark. And somewhere at the center of it all, the Thracian gladiator sat with whatever thoughts occupied a man who had, against every conceivable odd, come this far. Spring would come soon, and with it, Rome's full attention. There is a certain moment in the life of any great crisis when the people who have been managing it from a comfortable distance suddenly realize, with cold and clarifying shock, that it can no longer be managed from a distance at all, that the careful, measured responses they have been deploying, the delegated authority, the mid-ranking officials, the forces assembled with one eye still on other priorities, are no longer adequate, that the situation has grown past the container they built for it and is now something else entirely. Rome reached that moment in the spring of 72 BC. The Senate had, up to this point, treated the rebellion of Spartacus the way a wealthy household might treat a persistent leak in the roof, with genuine irritation, occasional attention, and the underlying assumption that someone of sufficient competence would resolve it before long. They had sent praetors. The praetors had failed. They had sent more men. Those men had also failed. The rebellion had survived an entire campaign season, wintered successfully, and emerged in the spring not weakened, as Rome had expected, but visibly, undeniably stronger. The Senate now did what it did when it was truly serious. It sent both consuls. The Roman consulship was the highest elected office in the Republic. 2 consuls served simultaneously, each capable of vetoing the other, each commanding the full weight of Roman institutional authority. In times of genuine military emergency, not border skirmishes, not provincial uprisings, but real, existential threats, the consuls led armies personally into the field. The dispatch of both consuls, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, at the head of substantial consular armies, was as clear a signal as the Roman state knew how to send. This was no longer a policing matter. This was war. The consular armies marched south into the landscape that Spartacus had, over the preceding months, made something close to his own. And here, in the complex and mobile campaigning of 72 BC, the rebellion reaches what might be called its most dazzling chapter, and simultaneously begins to show the first hairline fractures that would, in time, prove irreparable. The fractures did not come from Roman pressure. They came from within. Crixus, Spartacus's Gallic lieutenant, was a man of considerable personal courage and considerable personal impatience. He and Spartacus appear to have held genuinely different visions of what the rebellion was for and how it should be conducted. The ancient sources are frustratingly sparse on the details of their disagreements, but the broad shape of the divide is visible in what happened next. Crixus, at the head of a substantial force estimated at around 30,000 men, predominantly Gauls and Germans, who shared his instinct for direct, aggressive engagement, separated from the main body of the rebellion and moved independently through the region of Apulia, in the heel of the Italian boot. It is tempting, with the benefit of hindsight, to call this a catastrophic mistake. It was certainly a fatal one. Gellius and his consular army intercepted Crixus near Mount Garganus, on the Adriatic coast, in the early weeks of the campaign season. What followed was not the kind of engagement that the Roman armies of the previous year had experienced. The ambushes, the night attacks, the disciplined retreats that had so confounded Glaba and Verinius. Crixus fought in the open, in the straightforward, courageous, and ultimately insufficient way that his temperament demanded. His force was defeated. Crixus himself was killed in the fighting. 30,000 men, a third of the rebellion's total strength, were gone in a single engagement. Spartacus, when the news reached him, reportedly held funeral games in honor of Crixus, a gesture that was simultaneously a tribute to a fallen comrade, and, some historians have suggested, a deeply intentional act of symbolism. Roman aristocrats held gladiatorial games at the funerals of great men. Spartacus held gladiatorial games for his Gallic lieutenant, with captured Roman soldiers as the participants. The statement embedded in that gesture, about dignity, about inversion, about who deserved honor and who deserved to be made a spectacle, was the kind of thing that a man of genuine political intelligence does deliberately. And Spartacus was nothing if not deliberately intelligent. He did not grieve long. He could not afford to. What happened next remains one of the most astonishing sequences in ancient military history, and it deserves to be walked through slowly, because the scale of it is easy to underestimate if you move through it too quickly. Spartacus, having lost Crixus and 30,000 men, turned north and decisively defeated the consular army of Lentulus. Then he turned and defeated the consular army of Gellius. Then he defeated the forces of the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had moved to intercept him near the city of Mutina, modern Modena, in the broad, flat agricultural plain of the Po Valley. 3 separate Roman armies, including 2 full consular forces, defeated in a single campaigning season by a man who had begun the year absorbing the loss of a third of his strength. The Alps were visible from his position now, and this is where the story pivots on one of its most debated and most tantalizing moments. The passes were open. The path northward, out of Italy, away from Rome and its legions and its entire apparatus of retribution, was there. Many of his followers, particularly those of Gallic and Germanic origin who had homes, or the memory of homes, somewhere beyond those mountains, wanted to cross, to go north, to scatter back into the wider world where Rome's reach, while long, was at least not absolute. Spartacus turned south. Why he made this choice has occupied historians for 2,000 years and will almost certainly never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Some argue he had lost control of his army's direction, that the majority voted, in whatever rough democratic fashion the rebellion conducted its internal decisions, to remain in Italy. Others suggest he was drawn by the possibility, the extraordinary, audacious possibility, of marching on Rome itself, a city of perhaps 1 million people, the wealthiest and most powerful urban center in the Western world, now defended by armies that he had spent the better part of 2 years defeating. And still others suggest something more nuanced than either of these readings, that Spartacus understood with the cold clarity of a man who had been thinking several moves ahead since the slopes of Vesuvius, that crossing the Alps with an army of that composition, diverse, loosely unified, dependent on foraging from the Italian countryside they knew, was not the liberation it appeared to be. Beyond the mountains lay not safety, but dissolution. His army would fragment into its constituent peoples. The coalition he had built with such extraordinary care would evaporate, and each group would face whatever lay on the other side alone and depleted. Perhaps he turned south because south was where the fight still was, because the rebellion had never truly been about escape, because 70 men who had broken out of a cage in Capua had not done so simply to find a slightly larger cage beyond the mountains. Whatever his reasoning, the decision changed everything. Rome, absorbing the news of 3 consecutive military defeats with the particular tight-lipped horror that characterizes a great power confronting a genuinely unfamiliar situation, reacted the way it always reacted when sufficiently alarmed. It reached for its most capable instrument. Marcus Licinius Crassus was, in the year 72 BC, the wealthiest private individual in Rome, possibly the wealthiest private individual in the Roman world. His fortune, built through a combination of shrewd property acquisition, silver mining operations, and the kind of financial creativity that subsequent ages have viewed with varying degrees of admiration, was essentially without parallel. He was also deeply, persistently, and somewhat painfully ambitious, a man who had watched his contemporaries Pompey and Julius Caesar accumulate military glory, like other men accumulated furniture, and who understood, with the particular ache of the perpetually overlooked, that in Rome, wealth without military prestige was always somehow insufficient. He approached the Senate with an offer. He would raise and equip, at his own personal expense, an army of 6 legions, somewhere between 35 and 40,000 men, and he would end the rebellion of Spartacus himself, the Senate, which at this point was receiving the news of Spartacus's southern march with barely concealed panic, accepted. Crassus was a capable administrator and a methodical planner, but his early encounters with Spartacus's forces did not go smoothly. One of his lieutenants, a man named Memmius, disobeyed direct orders to avoid engagement and launched an attack that was repulsed sharply, his men retreating in disorder and abandoning their weapons in the process. Crassus's response to this failure illuminates something important about the man and about the Roman military culture he embodied. He selected approximately 400 of the soldiers most responsible for the rout, divided them into groups of 10, and executed one man from each group by lot. The ancient punishment known as decimation, which had not been employed in living Roman memory, the message was precise and deliberately brutal. The soldiers of Crassus's army would henceforth fear their own commander at least as much as they feared the enemy in front of them. Whether this constituted good leadership or simply ruthlessness, wearing leadership's clothing is a question worth sitting with. But it was effective, in the cold and narrow sense that effectiveness is sometimes measured. His army steadied. It began to move with greater purpose. Spartacus, meanwhile, had reached the southern coast of Italy, the region of Bruttium, the very toe of the Italian boot, and was looking across the narrow strait of water that separated the peninsula from Sicily. 3 miles of water. On the other side, an island whose enslaved population, by all accounts, was at least as desperate and at least as numerous as the one that had produced his current army, a Sicilian uprising to match the Italian one. The combined force that such a junction might produce was, if one followed the arithmetic with any seriousness, genuinely staggering. He needed ships, and he believed he had found a way to get them. The pirates of Cilicia, the eastern Mediterranean's most established maritime operators, men who existed in a permanent state of negotiated hostility with Rome, trading in contraband and human cargo with cheerful impartiality, were active in these waters. Spartacus sent negotiators. An agreement was reached, or so it seemed. Ships would be provided. The crossing would happen. The pirates took his payment and sailed away. Whether this was a simple betrayal motivated by profit, or whether Roman gold had quietly found its way into Cilician hands before Spartacus's did, the ancient sources do not say with certainty. What they confirm is the outcome. The ships did not come. The Strait of Messina, 3 miles wide and entirely crossable, might as well have been an ocean. Spartacus was stranded at the bottom of Italy. Behind him, 6 fresh Roman legions under the command of the most determined, best-resourced general he had yet faced were moving steadily southward. And Crassus, with the patience of a man who understood that geography could do much of his work for him, was already issuing orders for the construction of something extraordinary, a fortification that would run coast to coast across the peninsula, 37 miles of ditch and wall and palisade, designed not to defeat the rebellion in battle, but to seal it, starve it, and end it without the messy uncertainty of open combat. The trap was being built, and Spartacus, standing at the edge of a sea that had refused him, turned to look at what was coming. There is something uniquely sobering about the image of a wall being built, not the drama of a battle, not the sudden violence of an ambush or the sharp, decisive moment of a charge, just the slow, methodical, unglamorous work of men with shovels and timber, day after day, moving earth from one place and piling it in another. It lacks the romance that history tends to prefer. But walls, built by patient and determined hands, have ended more ambitions than any sword ever has. Crassus understood this. He had watched Rome's finest praetors and its sitting consuls go south to meet Spartacus on terms of Spartacus's choosing, and he had watched them fail, each in their own particular way, for the same essential reason. They had allowed the rebellion to dictate the geometry of the conflict. They had chased, responded, reacted, and in doing so had handed the initiative repeatedly to a man who knew exactly what to do with it. Crassus was not going to make that error. He was a man of business as much as a man of war, and what he was constructing in the autumn of 72 BC was not merely a military fortification. It was a transaction. He was purchasing the outcome he wanted with labor and lumber, and the one resource he had in abundance that Spartacus did not: time. The line of fortification Crassus ordered built across the Breton Peninsula is one of the more remarkable engineering undertakings of the late Republican period, not because it was technically complex. Roman military engineering had accomplished far more demanding projects, but because of its purpose and its scale in relation to the problem it was designed to solve. 37 miles, from the Tyrrhenian Sea on the west coast of the peninsula to the Ionian Sea on the east, a ditch 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep, running the entire length with a corresponding rampart of earth and timber constructed along its inner edge. The army of 6 legions worked in shifts, around the clock in the early stages, pressing to complete the line before Spartacus could react to what was being constructed behind him. And this, too, tells us something important about Crassus's reading of the situation. He was not certain that Spartacus would simply stand and watch his escape route being sealed. He was right to be uncertain. Spartacus attempted to negotiate first. The ancient sources record that he sent envoys to Crassus to discuss terms. The precise nature of those terms is lost, but the gesture itself is significant. It suggests a man who understood his deteriorating position clearly enough to explore alternatives to fighting through it, and who was not so consumed by pride or ideology that he would reject a negotiated outcome if one were available. Crassus refused to receive the envoys. He would not negotiate with a slave. The word is worth pausing on because Crassus used it deliberately. Whatever Spartacus had demonstrated over 2 years of campaigning, the tactical brilliance, the organizational genius, the capacity to hold a vast and diverse human coalition together through repeated crises. In the legal and social vocabulary of Rome, none of it changed what he was. He was property that had misbehaved. Engaging with him in the language of diplomacy, as one general to another, would have been a concession Crassus was constitutionally, ideologically, and politically unable to make. The wall continued to rise. Winter came early to the toe of Italy that year, or so the conditions Spartacus's army faced would suggest. Trapped south of Crassus's fortification line, cut off from the agricultural lands of Campania and Lucania that had sustained the rebellion through its campaigns, his forces began to experience something they had not seriously confronted before: hunger. The Breton Peninsula was not a rich agricultural region. It was mountainous, heavily forested, and relatively sparsely populated, which had made it a reasonable place to winter an army that intended to leave quickly, but a very poor place to sustain one that was being forced to remain. Foraging parties returned with diminishing returns. Supplies that had seemed adequate became inadequate. Men who had marched and fought through 2 years of improbable victories now sat in cold camps and watched the provisions shrink. Spartacus responded to this the way he had responded to every other constraint the situation had imposed on him, with creative, forceful action. He ordered the slaughter of the army's pack animals, the horses and mules that were consuming food his soldiers needed. This was a significant sacrifice, particularly with respect to the cavalry, which had been one of his most effective tactical assets throughout the rebellion. But cavalry that cannot be fed is not cavalry. It is simply a liability. And Spartacus had never been a man to preserve the appearance of strength at the expense of its substance. He also began making and stockpiling rafts. The Cilician pirates had failed him, but the Strait of Messina was still there, still only 3 miles wide, still offering Sicily and everything Sicily represented on the other side. If he could not buy passage across it, he would build it. His men worked through the winter months, constructing the crude watercraft that might, in sufficient numbers, carry at least a portion of the army across to the island. The engineering was not elegant. The timber available was whatever could be taken from the forests of the peninsula. But the intent was serious, and the work proceeded with the disciplined urgency that had characterized everything Spartacus organized. The currents in the strait defeated him. The waters between Brutium and Sicily are notoriously difficult, narrow enough that the tidal currents run fast and unpredictably, churned further by the winds that funnel through the gap between the two land masses. The rafts could not manage it, whether they broke apart in the attempt or whether the conditions made launching them impossible. The result was the same as the pirate betrayal. The sea would not be crossed, the wall behind him, the sea in front of him, the food running short. A lesser man might have surrendered to the arithmetic of the situation. Spartacus began planning his breakout. The night chosen was winter dark and bitter with cold. The kind of night that invites stillness, that encourages sentries to pull their cloaks tighter and think about warmer places. A night on which the soldiers manning 37 miles of fortification might be forgiven for a moment's inattention. Spartacus filled the ditch, not the whole of it, not 37 miles of careful excavation reversed in a single night. That was beyond the capacity of even his organized and experienced force. But a section, a length of the fortifications sufficient to allow the passage of a substantial body of men, packed with earth and timber, and the bodies of dead animals and whatever else could be gathered and carried and piled into 15 feet of Roman engineering. His men worked through the night in organized silence, and by the time the eastern sky began to suggest the approaching dawn, a crossing had been made. 1/3 of his army, approximately the vanguard, and the forces he could move most quickly, got through before Crassus's forces could respond and seal the gap. The remainder were forced back south of the fortification line to be dealt with in the weeks that followed. It was not the clean escape that a complete breakout would have been, but it was movement. It was initiative recovered. It was Spartacus, once again, doing something that the man on the other side of the ditch had not expected, and doing it in conditions that should have made it impossible. Crassus pursued with controlled urgency, leaving forces to contain those still trapped south of the wall while he moved north with the main body of his army, following the trail of the breakout force with the steady, implacable momentum of a man who knows that the geography is now working in his favor, regardless of what the enemy does. Rome, meanwhile, added one more complicating element to the strategic situation. The kind of complication that told Spartacus in unmistakable terms exactly how the Senate now assessed the threat he represented. They recalled Pompey from Spain, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Pompey the Great, as he would come to be called, was at this point Rome's most celebrated active military commander, freshly engaged in finishing Rome's long and costly war against the rebel general Sertorius in the Iberian Peninsula. Recalling him was not a casual administrative decision. It was an acknowledgement that Crassus alone, with 6 legions and a fortification line and every material advantage the situation offered, might still not be sufficient. They were sending for their best man, not as a replacement for Crassus, but as reinforcement, as insurance. The message encoded in that decision was perfectly legible to everyone who received it, including Spartacus. Rome was not taking any more chances. It was in this period, trapped between Crassus behind him and the knowledge of Pompey's approaching army ahead, that the internal tensions of the rebellion finally cracked open in ways that could no longer be papered over by shared urgency or the momentum of forward movement. 2 subordinate commanders, their names recorded as Castus and Gannicus, separated from the main body with a substantial force. Ancient sources suggest somewhere between 30 and 35,000 men, and moved independently, apparently in pursuit of a more aggressive, more direct confrontation with the Roman forces. It is difficult, at this distance, to reconstruct the precise nature of the disagreement that produced this split. Some historians have suggested it was strategic, that Castus and Gannicus favored fighting Crassus immediately, rather than maneuvering. Others have proposed it was personal, a matter of authority and prestige among men whose culture placed enormous value on individual warrior honor. Whatever the cause, the effect was devastating. Crassus, who had by this point developed a reasonably accurate understanding of how the rebellion operated and where its organizational seams ran, moved against the separated force with speed and precision. The independent force of Castus and Gannicus was caught in difficult terrain, engaged before it could either consolidate or retreat, and destroyed. Ancient sources place Roman losses in this engagement, suggesting it was not an effortless victory. Spartacus's men, even divided and caught at a disadvantage, were not easy opponents, but the outcome was not in doubt. 35,000 more men gone. Spartacus reportedly moved his own forces rapidly toward the sound of the fighting, attempting to reach his separated colleagues before the battle concluded. He arrived too late. He fought a rearguard action that extracted what survivors he could, and then withdrew in good order. Because Spartacus, even in retreat, in grief, in the accumulating shadow of everything that was closing around him, maintained the discipline and the composure that had defined him from the very beginning. But the numbers were now telling a story that composure alone could not rewrite. The army that had peaked at somewhere close to 100,000 was now a fraction of that strength. The consular armies that Crassus had displaced from the field were being reassigned and would return. Pompey was moving south through Italy with fresh legions. Marcus Lucullus, the governor of Macedonia, had landed additional Roman forces on the Adriatic coast from the east, adding a third arm to the encirclement that was slowly, methodically drawing tighter around whatever remained of the rebellion. The space available to Spartacus, the physical space, the strategic space, the space between the choices available to him, was shrinking with each passing week. He made one more decision, the last of his great decisions, the one that, in its combination of courage and fatalism and the particular dignity of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and chooses to do it anyway, has echoed across 20 centuries and shows no sign of going quiet. He would not run. He would not scatter. He would not dissolve the army into small groups and melt into the Italian countryside and spend whatever years remained available to him as a fugitive, always moving, always looking backward, trading the life he had built for the diminished life of a man in hiding. He turned to face Crassus, and the last battle of the greatest slave revolt in ancient history began to take shape on the flat, indifferent plain of Lucania, under a sky that neither knew nor cared what it was about to witness. There is a quality that exists in certain men at certain moments, a quality that is not quite courage, because courage implies the presence of fear successfully overcome, and what this quality suggests is something calmer than that, something more settled. It is the bearing of a person who has looked at the situation in front of them with complete honesty, measured it against every available alternative, and arrived at a place of genuine stillness, not resignation. Resignation is passive, and this quality is anything but. It is the active, deliberate choice to meet what is coming on one's own terms, rather than on the terms the world is attempting to impose. Spartacus, in the final weeks of his rebellion, had this quality in abundance. Those around him could see it. The ancient sources, even writing from the Roman perspective, even filtered through the particular lens of men who had every cultural reason to diminish and dismiss the man they were describing, cannot quite suppress it. Something comes through the centuries, despite the bias, despite the distance, despite the inevitable distortions of the record. The image that emerges from those final weeks is not of a man broken by accumulating defeat, but of a man who has made his peace with the shape of things and is preparing to act within that shape with everything he has left. He had, by the early months of 71 BC, perhaps 40,000 men remaining under his effective command. Against Crassus's 6 legions, with Pompey approaching from the north and Lucullus pressing from the east, this was not a force capable of winning the kind of comprehensive strategic victory that might have altered the fundamental outcome. Spartacus knew this. He was not a man who confused hope with arithmetic, but 40,000 men, led well, on ground of their own choosing, could still do extraordinary damage. And extraordinary damage at this particular moment still meant something. The plain of Lucania in early spring has a particular austere beauty. The hills roll back in long, unhurried curves, pale green in the early season, broken by stretches of open ground where the grass lies flat and the wind moves through it in slow, visible waves. It is not dramatic country. There are no passes to defend, no rivers to use as natural barriers, no high ground that commands the plain in the decisive way that a tactician might prefer. It is simply open space, patient and indifferent, asking nothing of whoever stands upon it. It was on ground broadly like this that Spartacus chose to make his stand. The choice itself has generated considerable historical discussion. Why here? Why not continue to maneuver, to delay, to use the mobility that had served the rebellion so well across 2 years of campaigning? The answer may lie partly in the deteriorating condition of his forces. Men who have been retreating and fighting rearguard actions through a difficult winter do not have unlimited capacity for further strategic maneuvering, and partly in something more fundamental about the situation. Pompey was closing from the north. Lucullus was pressing from the east. Crassus was behind him. The geometry of the encirclement was tightening in ways that made continued movement not a strategy, but a postponement. Every day of delay brought the Roman forces closer together and reduced the ground available to operate within. Better, perhaps, to choose the moment and the place himself than to have it chosen for him. He called his officers together in the days before the battle. The ancient sources preserve fragments of what was said, almost certainly reconstructed by later writers rather than transcribed from any primary record, but worth considering for the shape of the thinking they suggest. He spoke, apparently, not of victory in the comprehensive sense, not of Rome defeated and the rebellion triumphant. He spoke of fighting well, of meeting what was coming with the discipline and the courage that had defined the army from its beginning. There was, in the accounts that survive, no false comfort offered, no promises that the gods would intervene, that fortune would turn, that some unforeseen development would alter the mathematics of the situation, just the clear-eyed, steady instruction of a commander who respected his soldiers enough to tell them the truth. Then, in a gesture that ancient sources record with the kind of quiet emphasis that suggests they understood its weight perfectly well, Spartacus called for his horse. His personal horse, the animal that marked him, in the visual vocabulary of ancient warfare, as a commander. A man of status, a man who directed, rather than merely participated. A man whose survival was worth protecting because the army needed his mind and his judgment to function. He drew his sword, and he killed it. The message required no translation. In any of the dozen languages spoken by the men watching, if the battle went well, he would take a horse from among the Roman dead. There were always horses among the Roman dead when Spartacus fought, and if the battle did not go well, he would have no need of a horse at all. He was not planning his escape. He was not preserving his options. He was standing in the same place he was asking his men to stand, on exactly the same terms, with exactly the same stake in the outcome. He was staying. The battle that followed was, by the accounts available to us, savage in the way that battles between desperate men and determined armies tend to be. Not the clean, decisive engagement of military theory, but the grinding, personal, exhausting violence of men who have nothing left to hold back. Crassus formed his legions with careful Roman precision, the kind of formation that had been refined over centuries of warfare into something close to a perfect instrument. Interlocking shields, short swords designed for the confined space of close quarters fighting, disciplined rotation of the fighting line so that fresh soldiers continuously replaced the tired ones. It was a machine designed for exactly this kind of engagement, patient, methodical, and nearly impossible to break through the front. Spartacus aimed for Crassus directly. This is recorded clearly enough in the sources that It carries the ring of genuine historical fact rather than later embellishment. He understood, with a tactical clarity that had characterized his entire campaign, that the Roman force without its commander was a different and lesser thing than the Roman force with him. Kill Crassus, and the battle changed. Everything changed. He drove forward through the fighting with that singular purpose, cutting toward the place where the Roman commander's standards marked his position, and the fighting around him was of the kind that leaves a mark on the historical record, even through 2 millennia of subsequent noise. He killed 2 centurions who came at him together. The sources are specific about this detail in a way that suggests it was witnessed and remembered. 2 experienced Roman officers, the backbone of the legion's fighting strength, taken down in close combat by the man who had spent years in the gladiatorial schools, learning exactly how to kill trained fighters efficiently and completely. He kept moving forward. He did not reach Crassus. At some point in the battle's terrible middle passage, when the fighting had been going long enough that the initial formations had dissolved into the grinding, individual, close-range struggle that ancient battles almost always became, Spartacus took a wound to the thigh. The sources describe it as a spear thrust, serious enough to bring him to one knee. He fought on from his knees. This image, and it is one of the most quietly devastating images in ancient history, is recorded without embellishment in the surviving accounts. Not as heroic theater, not as the grand gesture of a man performing courage for an audience, but as simple fact. He went down. He kept fighting. The men around him, the soldiers who had followed him from Capua to the Alps and back again, who had shared 2 years of the most improbable sustained military achievement in the ancient world, fought to reach him and around him, and the battle continued to consume itself in the way that battles do. At some point, it ended. Spartacus did not survive it. His body was never found. This is stated plainly in the ancient sources, and it is one of the most haunting details of the entire story. The Roman army that held the field after the battle searched for him, because Rome wanted to display him, wanted the closure of a body to present to the public, wanted the definitive proof of finality that a corpse provides. They did not find it. Whether he fell in a part of the field that was subsequently obscured, whether his men carried his body away before the Romans could secure the ground, whether he was simply unrecognizable among tens of thousands of dead, the record does not say. He simply was not there. 6,000 of his followers survived the battle. Crassus had them crucified along the Appian Way, the great road that ran south from Rome to Capua, the road that passed the very city where the rebellion had begun. 1 cross every 100 feet or so for 120 miles. It was an act of deliberate, calculated, architectural brutality. Rome was not merely punishing the survivors. It was making a statement in the oldest and most unmistakable language available to power. It was converting the landscape itself into a message addressed to every enslaved person who traveled that road, or lived near it, or heard of it from someone who had. This is what happens. Crassus received a modest triumph, an ovation technically, rather than the full triumphal procession, because the Senate drew careful distinctions about the kinds of enemies whose defeat merited the grandest celebrations. A slave revolt, however large and however dangerous, was not quite the same as a foreign king. Pompey, who arrived from the north in time to intercept and destroy a remnant force of several thousand survivors attempting to escape through the highlands, absorbed a share of the credit that Crassus felt, with some justification, was more properly his. Their rivalry, already well established before the Spartacus campaign, deepened further. Crassus had done the work. Pompey had, as Pompey had a tendency to do, arrived at the end and positioned himself for maximum advantage. It was a dynamic that would color Roman politics for the next decade and eventually contribute to the chain of events that ended the Republic itself. History, as it tends to, contained within a single story the seeds of many others, and yet the part of this story that has outlasted all of it, outlasted Crassus's fortune, and Pompey's glory, and the republic they both served, and the empire that replaced it, is not the crucifixions on the Appian Way, nor the political maneuvering in the Senate, nor any of the careful institutional business of power reasserting itself. It is him, the Thracian gladiator who stood at the edge of the Mediterranean with no ships and no allies, and an army running short of food, and looked at the situation clearly, and then turned around and decided to fight anyway, who killed his horse before the last battle, so that everyone watching would know exactly what he meant, who went to his knees in the middle of the field and kept fighting, whose body was never found, so that the ending Rome wanted to deliver, final, closed, cautionary, complete, was never quite available. There is something in that incomplete ending that history has always found difficult to let go of. As if he did not entirely agree to stop, every great story eventually arrives at a moment of stillness. The battles are done. The armies have dispersed. The names that drove events forward have passed into whatever comes after names. And what remains, what actually remains, after the violence and the noise and the long, complicated machinery of historical consequence, has ground through everything it intends to grind through, is something quieter, something that resists the categories we try to place it in, something that continues to ask questions long after the people who lived it stopped being available to answer them. Spartacus has been asking questions for 21 centuries. He has not shown any particular inclination to stop. Consider for a moment what the rebellion actually was in the strict terms of its immediate outcome. It failed. This is simply true, and no amount of admiration for the man at its center changes the fact. The Roman slave system did not collapse. The Republic did not reform itself in response to what had happened. The hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who had not joined the rebellion, whether from fear or circumstance, or a reasonable assessment that the odds did not favor participation, remained in bondage. The Appian Way crosses through the Italian countryside today, as it always has, and the crosses that lined it are long gone, but the fact of them is not, by the measures that history most commonly applies to uprisings. Did it achieve its stated aim? Did it alter the fundamental structure of the system it opposed? The rebellion of Spartacus was a defeat, and yet something about applying that measure feels not exactly wrong, but insufficient, like describing a piece of music purely in terms of whether it resolved to its home key, and missing everything that actually happened between the opening note and the final chord. The Roman writers who documented the rebellion, Plutarch, Appian, Sallust, Florus, were not sympathetic observers. They wrote from within a civilization that depended on enslaved labor in the most literal and comprehensive sense imaginable. A civilization whose economy, whose domestic life, whose agricultural system, whose entire physical infrastructure was maintained by people who were legally defined as property. To acknowledge the rebellion as just, or its leader as admirable in moral terms, would have required those writers to sit with implications they were not culturally equipped to sit with comfortably. And yet they could not quite manage to make him small. Plutarch, writing over a century after the events, describes Spartacus with a kind of reluctant, persistent respect that breaks through his framing at irregular intervals, like light through an imperfectly closed shutter. He notes the man's intelligence, his restraint, the way he repeatedly attempted to prevent his followers from committing atrocities, understanding that a rebellion sustained by moral authority was more durable than one sustained by rage alone. His fairness in the distribution of plunder, which the sources emphasize as remarkable, given the nature of the men he was distributing it among. His evident personal courage, documented not in the abstract but in specific, observable actions on specific occasions. These are not the details a writer includes about a man he genuinely wishes to diminish. They are the details that survive because they were too well established and too widely known to be omitted without obvious dishonesty. The Roman literary tradition did what it could with Spartacus, and what it could was never quite enough to make him disappear. The afterlife of Spartacus in subsequent history is, in itself, a kind of testimony to the persistent power of what he represented. Every generation has found in him what it most needed to find. The Enlightenment discovered a symbol of natural liberty resisting institutional tyranny. The revolutionary movements of the late 18th and 19th centuries claimed him as a precursor and a patron. Voltaire wrote of him with unambiguous admiration, finding in the rebellion a template for resistance to illegitimate authority. The abolitionist movements of the 19th century, engaged in the most morally urgent political struggle of their era, recognized in his story a mirror for the suffering they were fighting to end, and a precedent for the argument that enslaved people would resist their bondage whenever the opportunity arose, that the system depended not on the contentment of those it imprisoned, but entirely on the comprehensiveness of their suppression. Karl Marx called Spartacus his favorite hero in all of ancient history. A genuine human being, a great general, noble character. The Soviet Union named a sports society after him, an acknowledgement both of the obvious symbolic resonance and of the particular way that political movements have always needed their ancient precursors. Their evidence that the instinct toward justice is not a modern invention but something woven into the long fabric of human experience. The 20th century gave him cinema. Stanley Kubrick's 1960 film with Kirk Douglas in the title role reached audiences that no ancient text could have reached, and the famous scene in which captured soldiers rise one by one to declare themselves Spartacus, to share his identity and his risk in an act of collective solidarity, became one of the most recognizable images in the history of popular culture. The scene was not taken from the ancient sources. It was invented by the screenwriter Dalton Trumbo, himself a man who had been blacklisted and imprisoned for refusing to name fellow members of the Hollywood Communist Party before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He understood, from the inside, what it meant to stand up and be counted when standing had consequences. Fiction, in this case, found a truth that the historical record had not explicitly preserved, but had somehow always implied. There is a question worth asking directly, here at the end of our time with this story. It is a question that the history itself raises and does not answer, because it is not the kind of question that history is able to answer. Was Spartacus free? Not in the obvious sense, the legal sense, the political sense, the sense that asks whether a man is owned by another man. He escaped that condition in the spring of 73 BC and never returned to it. But in the deeper sense, in the sense that asks what it means to live without the internal structures of subjugation, to move through the world as a person whose choices are genuinely their own, whose dignity is not contingent on someone else's permission. The philosophers of the ancient world had complicated thoughts on this subject. The Stoics, particularly, spent considerable energy arguing that true freedom was an interior condition, that a person could be legally enslaved and spiritually free, or legally free and spiritually in chains, depending on the condition of their mind and will. It is a beautiful and somewhat convenient argument, and it has been used, across subsequent centuries, in ways that range from genuinely liberating to deeply self-serving. But it contains something real. Something that the story of Spartacus keeps pointing toward. From the moment he descended the cliff face of Vesuvius in the dark, with woven vines and 70 companions and absolutely nothing guaranteed, he was making choices. Real choices, with real consequences, according to his own judgment about what mattered and what was worth fighting for. He was not free from danger. He lived in more danger than almost any person in the ancient world. He was not free from responsibility. He carried the weight of tens of thousands of lives alongside his own. He was not free from grief or failure, or the accumulating cost of 2 years at the center of something enormous and ultimately mortal. But he was choosing. At every turn, within every constraint, he was choosing. Not simply reacting, not simply surviving, but directing his own life according to values that he appears to have held with remarkable consistency: fairness, discipline, the protection of his people wherever that protection was possible, honesty about the shape of things, the refusal to purchase his own safety at the price of his dignity. Whether that constitutes freedom is a question each person listening to this story will answer differently, according to their own experience and their own understanding of what the word contains. The sun sets slowly over the Lucanian plain. The hills hold their pale color for a long time after the sky above them has begun its evening shift toward violet and then deeper blue. The grass lies quiet. The occasional light moves across a distant road, and there is, in the particular hush of that landscape at that hour, the sense that the ground beneath it has its own memory. The places where human beings have done extraordinary things retain something of what was done in them, not in any supernatural sense, but simply in the way that beauty and significance accumulate in a place and make it feel different from the places on either side of it. He was a man. This is important to hold on to. Not a symbol first, not a political instrument, not a metaphor for whatever a particular century needs him to be. He was a human being from a cold and mountainous country who was taken from his life by force and placed in a cage, and eventually decided, with 69 other human beings who had similarly been placed in cages, that the cage was unacceptable. Everything else, the battles, the victories, the army he built from almost nothing, the fear he placed in the heart of the most powerful republic on earth, the 2,000 years of meaning that subsequent generations have loaded onto his name. Everything else followed from that single, foundational, irreducibly human decision. The cage was unacceptable. He said so in the only language available to him, and the world has been listening ever since.